I am Shankar Kumar. I teach history at Hindu College in University of Delhi, and welcome to this series of lectures on history. And today we are talking about 19th century European history, particularly with reference to nationalism and nation states. And the topic for our today's discussion is nationalism and nation states in Europe, and we are only focusing on the types of nationalism. So, we are not talking of the theoretical arguments of the nationalism as a concept or nation state as an institution, nor are we looking at the historicity of this. We are just looking at the varieties of nationalism as a concept, as an ideology, and the nation state as an institution. Of course, the element of historicity will creep in different ways all through our discussion. Now, as you can see on your slide, I have listed some of the nationalism that has been spoken about by different scholars. For example, you have one variant of nationalism which is referred to as liberal nationalism, and that is something that you get to see in the early part of the 19th century. Similarly, romantic nationalism is also very much on display in the early part of 19th century, and it is for discussion purpose that we are looking at them in separate ways, but on the actual historical plane they could have combined to give effect to the idea of nationalism, and we will see how it actually unfolded. Similarly, another variant of nationalism is something that we get to see towards the middle of the 19th century in the form of the emergence of Italian state or German state as a result of unification process, unification of Italy and Germany. So that gives us a different you can say slice of nationalism that we can see across 19th century. We also have extreme nationalism as exemplified by the ideology of social Darwinism, scientific racism, radical, or you can say racial nationalism. There is an element of anti-Semitism that is very much inbuilt into the emergence of this ideology, which was extreme nationalism, and several states tried to emerge or riding on the shoulders of such sentiments. And finally, we have nationalism and identity. So, nationalism as a matter of identity. Now, before I get into the specificities of each of these, let me just remind the viewers that since we are talking of the 19th century Europe, let's be clear about this, that 19th century Europe in a big way, or the macro picture that we can draw of 19th century Europe, we cannot deal with 19th century European history without engaging with the concepts like liberalism, nationalism, and socialism. So, these three ideologies constitute the perennial theme of 19th century European history, and one has to come to terms with these ideologies which had different social constituencies all through the 19th century. For example, socialism is not that big a force as an ideology in the early part of 19th century European history, but by the time we reach the middle of the 19th century or the later half of the 19th century, it becomes a potent political force with a very organized social constituency, that of the industrial workers. It had ideologues like Marx, Engels, who were writing profusely, pamphleting and so forth, and therefore it created a different kind of reaction by different social groups, the conservatives, the bourgeoisie and so forth, and they took recourse to several other ideologies like nationalism, they took recourse to several other ideologies like conservatism and so forth in order to deal with it. So, it's not as if that they are to be, or nationalism is something that we can treat as a topic independent of the other major ideologies of 19th century Europe. Similarly, liberalism is for example, it is the bourgeoisie, it is the middle class which becomes the harbinger of liberalism in 19th century Europe. But to begin with, they also even had the workers, the industrial workers, when industrialization was just about beginning in major parts of Europe. So in the till around the first quarter or first 3-4 decades of the 19th century, we find the workers siding with the middle class to fight, to take on the aristocracy, the conservatives who had come back into power as a post Napoleon through the Congress of Vienna 1815 onwards. And by the time we reach the middle of the 19th century, by the time industrialization had fairly influenced greater part of Europe, these workers had organized themselves. They started seeing their interest, class interest, as different from the interest of the bourgeoisie or the middle class, and therefore we find some kind of a taking their own course kind of a thing, and that is something that you get to see in the failure of 1848 revolutions as well. So these are the things that have to be understood in its historical setting, in play alongside with several other contending and at times ideologies supporting each other, and at one point of time they take their own course and so forth. So there is a degree of complexity when we treat these topics in its actual historical context. But just for educational point of view, we are trying to delineate some of these concepts so that at least our understanding of the different variants, different types of nationalism that 19th century European history saw or gave examples of should be clear in our mind. And it is in this context that I have listed these examples. So let's begin with liberal nationalism, early 19th century. And let's see what are its attributes and so forth. Now, historically speaking, there is fair degree of togetherness exhibited by the liberal nationalism and the romantic nationalism. And as all of us know, that the first historical instance where these ideologies, which were extensively written about by the Enlightenment scholars, got the first chance to be played out on the historical plane through the French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, we will discover that the Republicans or the middle class, which was at the forefront in the form of the third estate. If you look at the third estate, the composition, the deputies that were elected, deputies means parliamentarians who were elected to the legislature, to the central legislature, or what we in French legislative institutions, you will find that there is a gap. The upper middle class actually ends up being the representative of the entire third estate, and now they are not only the representatives of the entire third estate, but they are representative of French as a nation, and that's how the idea of nationhood emerged. So they are moving beyond the states, the three categories, the first, second and the third estate, which traditionally had its own jurisdiction power, which had traditionally had its own legislative power. So they are merging their identity into one nation, and that's how the idea of nation grew on the real historical plane through the efforts of the revolutionaries. But here what you will find, that if you look at the first phase of the French Revolution, that is 1789 to say around 1792, that is a milder form of milder form of nationalism that you get to see, which is tinctured with liberal ideas that the Enlightenment scholars had written about. It's based on equality, it's based on civil rights, it's based on citizenship, it's based on a defined set of rights and privileges, do's and don'ts, and so forth. So the sense of sovereignty that is born out of this effort is a little bit different. It carries a lot of liberal elements with it. Of course, the sense of equality, the feudal past is done away with, the feudal privileges are done away with, but similarly, you can see a major lacuna or major drawback or major limitation is that when they talk of citizens, they only mean men. So the entire gender of females is excluded out of it. So, but keeping that apart, what we are saying here is that it is all based on some desired set of attributes, which is futuristic, which is something that they had imagined, something they thought is desired, and that is how this idea of liberal nationalism grew. And it was progressive. It broke the barriers of states. It brought new kinds of people together. So there is fair degree of inclusiveness and coming together to constitute this term called nation here at this stage, and that's the liberal aspect, liberal face of nationalism. But I told you about the fact that they are only thinking of males. Similarly, the voting rights is restricted on property considerations, so a vast majority of the lower third order is out of it, and that is something that came back in a big way in French Revolution during the Reign of Terror period. The Jacobins, the sans-culottes and so forth, who asserted the power of the mass, the power of the common people, and gave a different character to nationalism altogether. And there was fair degree of socialist infusion into the policies. The law of the maximum and so forth during the Reign of Terror are all symptomatic of the same push by the masses. And here you will find that the Jacobins, who are also part of the same set of battery of revolutionary leadership, they are giving some element of romanticism to the idea of nationalism alongside the liberal nationalism that was at play. And during the Reign of Terror, they emphasized the sentiments, the common heritage of people, motherland, and so forth. So that is something that we need to understand, that there is that sense of left politics which is at play during the Reign of Terror, and quite in contrast to what we get to see towards the middle of the 19th century, when it is the right element, when it is the right politics. I am talking of right and left in political sense of the term. When it is the political right that comes to monopolize the ideology of nationalism towards the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, here in French Revolution during the Reign of Terror, it is the left which is monopolizing the idea of nationalism, citizenship, patriotism, and so forth. The entire battery of French revolutionary leadership is guillotined merely on the charges like not being patriot enough, not being loyal enough, and so forth. These are symptomatic of romantic notion of nationalism that we get to witness even during the French Revolution. So, moving beyond this, is the idea of citizenship of a republic, where the citizen is not a subject of a monarch. It is a new category altogether. Citizen is equipped with a set of rights, privileges, and so forth, a set of duties as well. And there is the element of equality, there is the element of civil rights, and also what Rousseau extensively wrote about, that this idea of citizenship in a republic, which is liberal nationalism, this will work only when the citizens participate in governance of the state. So, it is not as if a monarch and his kins will take care of the paraphernalia of the state and apparatus of the state, and the general people, common people, is just the praja or the subject. As the word itself, subject, is there is inbuilt hierarchy, that there is someone at the top and there is someone towards the lower part of the demography which constitutes subject. So, that is done away with. There is fair degree of progressivism, doing away with the pre-existing order of hierarchy and so forth, that the idea of citizenship on which the idea of liberal nationalism was premised brought about. But as I said, that Jacobins also invoked the sense of loyalty to the nation, and hence they were equally romantic. Similarly, across time, after the French Revolution, we have the Napoleonic phase, and till Napoleon was defeated around 1814 and the Congress of Vienna was held, where the conservatives came back to power. What happened during the Napoleonic period is that these ideas, revolutionary ideas of a liberal nation state, a liberal nationalism, also tinctured with the element of romantic nationalism, got introduced in different parts of Europe, because Napoleon had embarked upon the policy of creating an empire. So, outside France, several regions of Europe which earlier had only experienced monarchy as the political or the type of polity, they are the people who for the first time had a direct interface with what a modern nation state premised on the principle of equality, rational legal state apparatus like bureaucracy, rule of law, etc. So, for the first time they saw that, and they also were introduced to the idea of nationalism premised on these dreams and these emotions. And despite the defeat of Napoleon by around 1814, 1815, what we find that even after the Congress of Vienna settled the matter by putting the clock back to pre-1789 monarchical position, what we find that in these pockets several social groups, particularly the middle class, the bourgeoisie and the younger lot, they got very restive and they started creating lot of clamor for creation of modern nation state, which is based on rational legal principles and with modern institutions like bureaucracy and so forth, and they were not ready to live under monarchical forms. And that is the power of this ideology of nationalism, which was introduced at the behest of Napoleonic empire having its presence over these areas. And the best example or the earliest example of this sentiment giving some tangible result in the form of creation of a nation or creation of a modern state, so to say, which is different from the usual monarchical dynastic politics, is that of the Greece. And here you must have heard of Alexander Ysplanti and so forth. What happens is that despite the legal provisions or the treaties that various victors or victorious parts after the Congress of Vienna had come into agreement, that wherever there is revolutionary kind of insurrection in any part of Europe, these powers would intervene and stop that, would quell that. But you find that in the 1820s and by 1830s, it was clear that these stipulations of Congress of Vienna is not going to hold for long under the pressure generated by the common people, by the masses, by the younger lots who were now clamoring for a different kind of set of rights and so forth, exemplified by citizenry. And that is something that is exhibited by this Greek example, and the armed resistance by the Greek nationalist leaders forced the Turkish Ottoman Empire to recognize the independence of a new Greek nation state in the first half of 19th century itself, and that tells you about the power and pressure that could be generated by this ideology. Similarly, you have another range of nationalism that we get to see here. Multi-ethnic Austrian Habsburg Empire was shaken by revolts of nationalist Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, Romanians, Serbs, and the list is long. Again, here you find that there is some sense of restiveness against the existing monarchical order, and some kind of a clamor to create a modern nation state which is premised by the powerful idea of nationalism. Now, what is the actual premise of this nationalism is something that we will see. What we get to see till around the middle of the 19th century Europe is that while liberal nationalism was based on rational republican values, the Romantics stressed upon the uniqueness of a particular people and their history. They said that some people have a national essence, some set of people, some communities have a national essence. It is about a subjective feeling. It is not about something which is desired politically, and that's why they should have it, but because something which constitutes them. So nationalism is something which constitutes some set of people, and they are together because they have been together. And so this kind of interpretation, or this kind of or this variant of nationalism imbued nationalism with a spiritual quality. So German Romantics called this Volksgeist, or the spirit of people, and it is in this sense that we start finding some traces of chauvinism, like my nation is the greatest kind of thing, and bigotry and stereotyping is something that accompanied Romantic nationalism, and that is something that we get to see in different parts of Europe as we move on. Similarly, by the middle of the 19th century, we have instances of unification of Italy or emergence of Italy as a modern state. Similarly, we have Germany coming up as a modern state. Now, these states are different from the French Republic that was created, because it is not premised on liberal understanding, or liberal, the premise is not liberal nationalism, but unification of Italy, as you can see on your slide, is a consequence of bold political moves and military calculations by the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, Cavour, and the effective leadership provided by the 1848 hero Garibaldi, and Italy or these independent states of Italy entered into alliance, tacit and tactical strategic alliance with France and Prussia, and that is how ultimately a constitutional monarchy in the form of Kingdom of Italy in 1861 was established. Now, this is different from other kinds of or the previous instances that we saw. So, it's more a consequence of political moves, military calculations, and so forth. So, that's another way in which states were created. Similarly, unification of Italy, where nationalism was used as a force of political right, it is the conservatives. So, if you look at the social background of Bismarck, the architect of unification of Italy, you find that he comes from an aristocratic Prussian background, and there is Austro-Prussian War of 1866, Franco-Prussian War 1870-71, and that's how the coalition of German territories emerged as some kind of a German empire. It is not kind of a liberal state in the conventional sense of the term, but that's how German nationalism got built. So it used resources, it plumbed resources in a different way, resorted to wars, resorted to alliances, and that's how these nation states were created, and the idea of nationalism was given a different kind of a tinge altogether. Similarly, you get to see Irish and Hungarian cases. Now, these are the cases where there is element of separatism, or you can say that they are not happy with the kind of arrangement of a liberal state in the existing state paraphernalia. So, be it the case of Ireland, who are trying to come out of Britain. Similarly, the Hungarians who are trying to come out of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that is something that got played out well into the 20th century politics as well, or the last quarter of the 19th century as well, leading to First World War and so forth. So, there is that element of separatism also inbuilt into the idea of nationalism. Then there is social Darwinism. Darwinism, all of us know, survival of the fittest and so forth, struggle for existence, and this was taken to some kind of an absurd level, where this Darwinism, his postulation was understood in terms of national categories or racial nationalism. So, some communities are superior and therefore they need to win, they need to conquer the other communities, then only they'll establish themselves as the superior most race, and that is what drove this ideology of nationalism. So, that was at the root of this nationalism. So, such kinds of devices, such kinds of you can say mobilization was also resorted to, and anti-Semitism, that is anti-Jew kind of sentiments which was pumped up, and the last quarter of 19th century and the early part of 20th century leading to First World War has a lot of stories related to anti-Semitic sensibilities. And it is this kind of transformation that the famous sociologist Durkheim talks about in terms of his concept of anomie, that is normlessness, and maybe that the subsequent nationalism or nation state that got created as a new category gave them a new identity. So, that is something that is defined by him in terms of mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity and so forth. So, that sums up the range of types that we get to see with respect to nationalism in 19th century European history. Thank you.